And when you truly begin to understand this, you stop deceiving yourself. You stop believing that tomorrow will be different. You stop depending on motivation. You stop waiting for the right moment. Because you realize something simple, but powerful. If today is the same as yesterday, tomorrow will be the same as today. And that removes the illusion. Because now there is no vague hope. There is evidence. Your future stops being an expectation and becomes a logical consequence. And that completely changes your posture. Because you understand that you don't need more time. You need more precision. Precision in what you repeat. Precision in what you maintain. Precision in what you eliminate. Andrew Carnegie operated with this level of clarity. He didn't let the day happen. He directed the day. And that's a point very few master. Most people live reactively. They wake up and respond to what appears. Messages, problems, demands, distractions. And before they realize it, the day is over. But nothing was built. Only reactions. And reacting does not build the future. Building requires intention. Now think about this carefully. Are you controlling your day? Or is your day controlling you? Because that answer defines everything. Your focus, your energy, your results. Now let's go deeper. There is a silent behavior that destroys progress. Reactivity, acting only when something happens. Making decisions based on what arises. And that puts you at a disadvantage. Because you're not creating. You're just reacting. Carnegie was not reactive. He was proactive. He decided in advance, planned in advance, executed in advance, and that gave him an advantage. Now understand this clearly. Whoever controls the day, controls life, because the day is the basic unit of your future. And if you lose control of the day, you lose control of the direction. Now here's a practical shift. You need to define fixed behaviors, not tasks. Behaviors. Because tasks change. Behaviors remain. Example. It's not work more. It's work with focus for X time every day. It's not make money. It's create value every day. It's not improve. It execute consistently. Because behavior creates pattern. And pattern creates results. Now let's move to a critical point. You must stop trusting your emotional version. Because it is unstable. Some days are good, some are bad, some are neutral. And if you depend on that, your results will fluctuate. But if you create a pattern, regardless of how you feel, you stabilize your progress. And stability builds growth. Carnegie didn't operate based on mood. He operated based on system. And system doesn't fail. Now observe this. How many times have you avoided doing something important? Because you weren't in the mood? And how many times did that delay your life? That is the hidden cost. It doesn't show immediately, but it accumulates. And over time, it becomes a massive difference. Now here is the turning point. You need to become predictable. Predictable to yourself. To know that, regardless of the day, you will act. You will execute. You will maintain the pattern. And that builds internal trust. Because now you don't depend on luck. You depend on consistency. And consistency is controllable. Now let's go one level deeper. There is a direct connection between daily behavior and identity. You are not what you think. You are what you repeat. If you repeat discipline, you become disciplined. If you repeat focus, you become focused. If you repeat consistency, you become consistent. And that changes everything. Because a strong identity eliminates internal conflict. You don't need to decide all the time. You already know what you do. Now imagine operating like this, without doubt, without negotiation, without procrastination, just execution. That accelerates everything. Because it eliminates waste. And waste is what holds most people back. Lost time, scattered energy, fragmented attention. And that prevents real progress. Carnegie eliminated waste and concentrated energy on what mattered, and that made each day count. Now bring this to your level. If each day truly counted, where would you be today? That question shows exactly what needs to change. Not your goal, but your behavior. Now here is the close of this part. You don't need to change everything. You need to change enough to create a new pattern. A pattern you can sustain. A pattern you repeat. A pattern you maintain even on difficult days. Because those days define everything. Not the good days, the normal days, the hard days, the days without motivation. And those who sustain on those days build something solid. Now the final question. If someone observed your daily behavior, could they predict your future? Because the answer is yes, and that gives you control. Because if you don't like what you see, you can change it. Today? No. In the next behavior. Because that's where everything begins. And that's where everything changes. And when you start to change this level of behavior, something powerful happens. Your day stops being random and becomes strategic. You no longer wake up to see what happens. You wake up knowing what must be done. And that eliminates one of the biggest energy drains, indecision. Because constant decision-making is exhausting. It consumes focus, drains energy, and by the end of the day, you feel tired without having produced what truly matters. But when you define your pattern in advance, you eliminate that friction. You don't decide. You execute. And that massively increases your efficiency. Andrew Carnegie operated this way. He minimized unnecessary decisions and focused his energy on what truly produced results. Now understand this clearly. Repeated decisions become behavior. Repeated behavior becomes pattern. Repeated pattern becomes results. And repeated results become destiny. Everything starts with behavior. Always. Now let's go deeper. There is a silent mistake that holds many people back. Trying to change everything at once. Changing routines. Changing habits. Changing mindset. Changing everything. And that doesn't last. Because it's heavy, complex, hard to sustain. And what is hard to sustain gets abandoned. Carnegie didn't rely on constant radical changes. He relied on consistent adjustments, small, but sustainable. And that accumulated. Now here is a simple, but extremely effective strategy. Choose one key behavior, and sustain it every day. No exceptions. It may seem small, but it's not. Because that behavior starts to influence others and creates a chain reaction. Discipline builds discipline. Focus builds focus. Execution builds execution. And before you realize it, your entire pattern has changed. Now understand this deeply. You don't need maximum effort. You need consistency. Because maximum effort burns out. Consistency builds. And building is what you need. Now let's move to a critical point. There is a moment when your behavior is tested. Not when things are easy, but when they are hard. When you are tired, unmotivated, low on energy, without desire. That is when your real pattern shows. And that is when your future is defined. Because anyone can perform well on good days, but few maintain standards on bad days. And those few are the ones who advance. Carnegie valued consistency under pressure because he knew that's what separates amateurs from builders. Now think honestly. Who are you on difficult days? Because that answer matters more than any plan. Now here is a direct truth. You don't need to be at your best. You need to be consistent. Because average consistency beats occasional intensity. Always. Now let's go one level deeper. Daily behavior doesn't just build results. It builds identity. And identity defines everything. If you repeat a pattern long enough, you stop trying and start being. And when you start being, there is no more effort. There is natural execution. And that changes the entire game. You don't force yourself to act. You act because that's who you are. Now imagine this long term. No negotiation. No breaks. No drop in standard. Just consistency. Do you understand what that builds? Not just results, but a version of you operating at another level. Now here is the key point of this stage. You don't need a new goal. You need a new daily pattern. Because goals define direction, but patterns define results. And without pattern, goals turn into frustration. Now simplify everything. What behavior, if repeated daily, would change your life? Identify it, define it, and sustain it. Because that's what works. Now here is the close. You are not far from the future you want. You are far from the behavior that creates that future. And that gap is closed through action. Daily, consistent, intentional. So from now on, stop chasing big changes and start sustaining small ones. Because they build everything. And those who understand this don't get lost, don't oscillate, don't depend on luck. They depend on pattern. And pattern, when well built, takes you exactly where you decided to go. No detours, no delays, no doubt, just continuous construction. And that, in the long run, is unbeatable. And when you sustain this pattern long enough, something inevitable happens. You begin to rise above average, not because you did something extraordinary, but because you did the basics with extraordinary consistency. And in the real world, that is rare. Most people don't fail because of lack of ability. They fail because of lack of consistency. They start, stop, return, quit, restart, and live in that cycle. But when you sustain your pattern, you break that cycle, and you enter a different game, the game of accumulation. And accumulation builds every meaningful result. Andrew Carnegie understood this precisely. He knew that small actions, repeated long enough, create disproportionate results. Results that, from the outside, look fast, but in reality, were built in the invisible. Now understand this deeply. Real growth is silent. It doesn't make noise. It doesn't attract attention. It doesn't bring immediate applause. But it is happening every day, with every repetition, with every maintained decision. And that's why many people quit. Because they don't see immediate results. They think it's not working. And they stop. But those who understand the game continue. Because they know results are not immediate. They are cumulative. Now think about this. How many times have you quit something because it wasn't working? And how many times, if you had continued just a little longer, everything would have changed? That is where most people lose. Not because of inability, but because of lack of strategic patience. Carnegie operated with long-term vision. He didn't measure progress in days or weeks, but in complete cycles. And that changes everything. Because you stop reacting to the short term and start building in the long term. Now let's move to a key point. You must learn to trust the process, even when you don't see results, even when it feels slow, even when there is no validation, because that is exactly when the construction is happening. And that requires maturity, emotional control, clarity, because your mind will try to convince you to stop, to change, to chase something new. But the new is often just escape from the process. Now here is a powerful shift. Stop measuring your progress by results. Start measuring it by consistency. If you maintained your pattern today, you won, even if the result hasn't appeared yet. Because results come later. They always come, but only for those who sustain. Now let's go deeper. There is a moment when everything starts accelerating. A point where accumulation becomes visible, where effort begins to return, where results appear. But that point only comes for those who didn't stop before. And that's why few reach it. Because they quit in the middle, in the invisible. in the silence. But those who continue enter another level, where growth stops being linear and becomes exponential. And that changes everything. Carnegie lived this. He didn't grow in a straight line. He accumulated until growth exploded. And this applies to any area, but it requires time and consistency. Now understand this as a rule. Everything built with consistency multiplies over time. Everything, without exception, but only for those who sustain. Now here is the final close. Your future is not hidden, not far, not out of reach. It is being built right now, in what you repeat, in what you maintain, in what you sustain. And that gives you power, because it means you don't depend on luck. Don't depend on perfect opportunity. Don't depend on ideal timing. You depend on yourself, on your pattern, on your consistency, on your decision to continue. Now the final question. Will you continue being someone who starts and stops, or someone who sustains until you build? Because that choice defines everything, not once, but every day. In those days, build your life. So from now on, stop chasing the extraordinary and start mastering the common, because it is in the common that the extraordinary is built, silently, consistently, inevitably. And when you understand that, there is no more doubt, no more oscillation, no more excuses. There is pattern, and pattern, when sustained, takes you exactly where you want to go, always. And when you get there, you will realize something simple, but powerful. It wasn't luck. It wasn't chance. It was repetition. It was consistency. It was daily decision. And all of that was under your control the entire time. And when you fully take ownership of this, you stop looking for external explanations. You stop blaming circumstances. You stop waiting for ideal conditions. Because you understand something that completely changes your behavior. You are not stuck because of lack of opportunity. You are stuck because of lack of pattern. And that is liberating. Because if the problem were external, you would have no control. But since it is internal, you can change it. No, today. In the next behavior. Andrew Carnegie operated at this level of responsibility. He didn't ask, why did this happen to me? He asked, what do I need to adjust to change the result? And that question changes everything. Because it takes you out of the victim position and puts you in the builder position. And builders don't wait. They act. Now understand this deeply. Responsibility is not a burden. It is power. Because when you accept that your behavior defines your future, you take control of your trajectory. And control creates direction. Now let's go deeper. There is a point where most people lose themselves. Comparison. Looking at others. Comparing results. Comparing speed. Comparing achievements. And that creates frustration. Because you don't see the process. Only the outcome. And that distorts everything. Carnegie didn't compare. He concentrated. He understood that each person is at a different stage. But the principle is the same. Those who sustain the pattern build results. Now here is an essential shift. Stop competing with others. Start competing with your yesterday's standard. Because that is controllable. And that creates real progress. If today you are better than yesterday, you are on the right path. Now let's move to a critical point. You must eliminate the need for validation. Because as long as you depend on recognition, you will fluctuate. You will act when seen, stop when unseen, and that destroys consistency. But when you operate by pattern, you don't need applause. You don't need encouragement. You execute. Because that is your base. Carnegie didn't seek approval. He sought results. And results come from silent execution. Now understand this. What you do in silence defines what appears in results. And that is non-negotiable. Now let's go one level deeper. There is a dangerous trap, thinking you are already doing enough. Because the brain always tries to conserve energy. It tries to justify, to settle, and that lowers your standard without you noticing. So you need something clear, conscious self-demand, knowing exactly the level you want to operate at, and not accepting less, even when no one is watching, even when it would be easier to relax, because that is where the pattern is either built or broken. Now here is a direct truth. What you tolerate today defines where you will be tomorrow. If you tolerate inconsistency, you build instability. If you tolerate distraction, you build delay. If you tolerate partial execution, you build limited results. But if you raise your standard and sustain it, you completely change your trajectory. Now let's close. You don't need a new goal. You don't need a perfect plan. You don't need an ideal opportunity. You need a pattern you don't break. Because that is what builds everything. So simplify. What is the behavior you will no longer negotiate? Define it and sustain it every day. Because that is what works. Now understand this as a final truth. Your future is not decided once. It is decided daily, in every choice, in every action, in every repetition. And that puts you in control. Completely. Now the decision is yours. Stay on autopilot, or take control. Keep reacting, or start building. Keep starting and stopping, or sustain until transformation. Because in the end, it's not about what you want. It's about what you sustain. And those who sustain the right pattern don't just get there. They stay there. And that is what truly matters. So from now on, no excuses, no negotiation, no fluctuation, only pattern. Because pattern is destiny, and destiny is built by you every single day, without exception. And when you truly understand that, there is no going back, because you finally realized the behavior you repeat today is already creating the future you will live. And now, you decide what that future will be.